Mr. Darren Koenig from the US. He's the Vice President, Product Development and Management for Numerex. So please could you all give a very warm welcome to Darren Koenig. Thank you.
Those guys were right. It is bright up here. Wow. Well, hi, everybody. Thank you very much for coming this afternoon. For the guys in the back, can I ask you to throw the presentation on this screen as well? Tend to point at things a good bit. So I've been asked to join you today to talk a little bit about asset tracking and monitoring and how it works. When it comes to witty quotes, I know that Bill Gates is no comparison for Winston Churchill. But he did say one thing that I find really applicable to the situation in M2M today. And what he said was, people tend to overestimate how much progress is going to be made in 2 years, and they tend to underestimate how much progress is going to be made in 10. And I think that that's where we are in terms of the M2M environment today. I think we're going to see a whole lot of progress in 2 years, but I think we have a pretty good idea of what some of it is. And there have been a number of questions over the course of the couple of days of the conference so far that have drilled down a little bit on which industries do we think are going to be successful, which solutions do we think are going to grow. And I want to talk about, there are many, certainly there are several that have got great opportunities, but I want to talk a little bit about asset tracking and monitoring specifically, because I think that this is one that is inherently a global opportunity that's applicable to everybody. So first, who is Numerex and what do we know about M2M? Well, Numerex is a 20-year-old publicly traded company who is focused exclusively over that 20 years on machine-to-machine communications. We have about 1.5 million subscribers in M2M in over 50 different vertical markets. And we were the first in the space to get the ISO 27001 security certification for data security. And we've been very, very engaged in standards over the years. We have customers in many countries around the world, and I'm excited to walk through a couple of examples. What I thought I would do is go through a couple of specific examples of what some implementations around the world have looked like in terms of M2M. But before I do that, I thought I'd start out with how it actually works. Because there's been a lot of discussion so far about about people moving up or down in the value chain for M2M. I think that there's a very specific solution stack that exists, and it's worth talking about. As I would break it down, I'd say that there are nine different levels in that value chain. At the very bottom is the physical layer, where things actually exist that are being measured by an M2M solution. That's where sensors and data input exist. The level above that would be the physical device layer, which contains the connectivity. And maybe these two are in the same box, or maybe they're not. But that device could very well be a smart device sitting at the edge that sorts through the information that's coming in and decides which is relevant to report and which isn't. And that kind of control over data at the edge before it's actually transmitted is really important for the efficiency, not just of the mobile operator's network, but the cost effectiveness of the solution that the customer delivers. Above that is a network connectivity layer. That's where the data physically moves through the air to get from where it started to into the cloud and where it's going. Sitting on top of that is the network authentication, provisioning, and control layer, where you're able to interact. You're purely digital at this point. You're able to interact with the device and the connectivity within the services provider. Above that is where we start to get into controlling the device from within the cloud. And that could break down into being able to control the firmware as a whole and potentially write a whole new operating system or a whole new set of plans into a device that's being deployed to that one. Or it could be the configuration of a device that's deployed where you want to change, for example, the parameter that relates to how frequently you report or what kinds of information you'd like to have delivered today. Above that is when you first start to get into the real data management piece, the piece where you start to add value to the information that's been collected remotely. Here we're talking about first taking the data in and then normalizing it. Something that's really perhaps underappreciated is the diversity of different kinds of information that come from different kinds of devices that are reporting. If you've got an implementation that's all the same kind of digital meter being read, for example, maybe all the data comes in and it's the same. But if you've got a diverse fleet of trucks and cars and trailers and containers Perhaps the information is coming in completely different formats. So the first thing you got to do is normalize the information, and then database it, and then you can move up to the layer where you first start to manipulate it, where you can start to do things like geocoding, discovering exactly where things are, calculating trip length reports, or doing more sophisticated geofences or other kinds of process. That layer is also, from a platform perspective, that's also where your web services layer would live. The idea that you've now collected information, you've now added value to it. You're not done with it yet, but you've added value to it. And you can make that information available either to a software as a service layer that you provide that sits perhaps within that same managed infrastructure, or provide it to a different system. For example, enabling web services calls to deliver information out to a different company's existing ERP platform. Now, the goal of this entire stack is one thing. You're collecting potentially a gigantic amount of information at the bottom. Your goal is to deliver actionable, smart data out of the top. And that's what M2M is about. M2M is about creating return on investment for a customer, and you do that by assessing information and distilling it down to the pieces that are the most important. Excuse me. I'd make 4 observations about that stack as we look at it. The first one is that each one of these different layers has many dozens, many hundreds in some cases, of different potential suppliers of that piece. So there's a tremendous amount of diversity in each one of these layers. The second observation would be, and we wouldn't say this about anyone in the room, of course, but it has been said on occasion that I've heard mobile network operators say in the past, well, I've now partnered with a SIM management company, so I'm ready to deploy M2M. And a few of us were talking about it last night, and it is kind of a common misperception. But by partnering with a SIM management platform, which is a really valuable thing for you to do, you've automated the interactions with yourself. You've added a lot of value, but you've also left a lot of work for the customer to do to actually make a solution work. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And the third one is that if you look at the stack and you think of all the different potential participants, really ownership of the customer could come from any of those pieces. Any of those guys could bundle the solution and sell it to the customer, and that's okay. It's okay if the person who provides the network connectivity actually buys these other things from somebody else and bundles them for a customer. It's okay if an SI provides the whole piece. It's all right if the guy who sells software as a service bundles all the other stuff underneath it and sells it to a customer. The important thing is that the entire stack is required to deliver an M2M solution, and that there's value created by all of those pieces working together. And speaking of which, and I don't say this just because it's one of the things that we really focus on. While we participate at each different layer within that stack, there is a tremendous amount of value that's created by being the mortar that sticks those building blocks together. That's where a tremendous amount of value is created. And so that's the thing that's necessary in order to make M2M solutions work for a customer. There are a bunch of reasons why businesses decide to deploy an M2M solution, but ultimately what it comes down to is return on investment. It's the idea that I can now create more value for my business than it costs me to do it. And what's fantastic about our position in the M2M market right now is that the costs, the underlying costs, the hard costs that sit underneath M2M have never been lower than they are right now, and they're still in the process of dropping. And that goes from the cost of the modules to the cost of the connectivity to all of the other factors that go in. And what that means is, if we look at asset tracking or monitoring specifically, basic asset tracking, as little as 5 years ago, you couldn't make a business case that made it financially viable to track an asset that was worth less than $20,000 or $25,000. Just couldn't make it work. Today, you can track an asset that's worth $3,000 or $4,000 and still show a gigantic return on investment. And that is a big deal when it comes to talking about the addressable market size. And that's how, when we talk about M2M as undergoing this explosion in terms of growth rate, It's because solutions no longer have to be built only for really specific, very high value enterprise solutions. They can start to democratize and become more general. And that the idea of horizontal M2M solutions, like asset tracking is, really is the first piece that lets you talk about getting into true mass market adoption and going beyond specific, enterprise-specific implementations. And that's great for everybody. The next key piece, in order to make that explosion happen, now that the pricing is there, and so many people within this room and elsewhere are dedicated to building that infrastructure, is market awareness and the ability for the salespeople to actually talk to the markets to be able to articulate the value proposition. So, as we talk about, and I'll take you through a couple of specific examples. Hassan asked me to keep it brief, so I'll go pretty quickly. As we talk through a couple of examples of real-world implementations, just to give you a sense of how different pieces can build on one another. And there used to be one model for M2M deployments, and it was, I will build a custom solution for this particular customer. And then we began to figure out that we could still do that, and that adds a tremendous amount of value, but you could build horizontal applications that would the same solution was suitable for everybody. But if you built the right solution stack, there's a piece in the middle, which is arguably the most valuable chunk of real estate of all, which is I can build a configurable M2M solution, which lets me customize it for a customer, but without having to reinvest in the infrastructure and a lot of custom development for each one of those implementations. And that's how we start to get to the real growth. So I'm going to give a couple of specific examples. Like I said, I'm going to try to avoid naming names, and maybe we'll bleep it out if I blurt one out. But it's interesting. Let's start with a pure horizontal solution. There is in this case, it's a large government agency who deploys, in this case, trailers to relieve people in the case of a hurricane in the United States. And because these assets used to get lost on occasion, they now are each equipped with a satellite tracking device, which keeps track of where that device is, and you can recover it even during the worst of conditions. Now that's a point-specific solution. That particular agency needed the solution and needed to be satellite-based because of the nature of the deployments that they did. But if you take that solution and you genericize it, you can take satellite connectivity, you can marry it with cellular connectivity, and you can have really cost-effective horizontal global asset management solutions. And you can take this exact same solution, and instead of needing to track instead of needing something as expensive as a trailer to validate the business model, you can track a snowmobile, or a boat, or a shipping container, or a trailer, or many other types of things. So that's one great example. The next example is a pallet. Now this is kind of neat, and this actually presents a couple of different opportunities. The idea of tracking a pallet is interesting, and you use the same fundamental technology, the same platform capabilities. You use all the same stuff to track a pallet. But what's neat about a pallet is it's not just a dot on the map wherever in the world it might be. It is instead an indication of where the supplies that are stacked on that pallet are, which is a totally different use of exactly the same technology. So the idea that I can now, as a company, I can invest in RFID and barcode scanning and a bunch of other technology, and I can figure out where exactly in my warehouse my stuff is. But what happens when it goes outside the four walls? I have no visibility. With a pallet that has this technology built into it, I now have visibility to my supply chain outside of my business. And that represents what we would call an infrastructureless supply chain monitoring piece. And if you tie that into some basic technology that easily exists today, you can tie that into geofencing or geocoding, and you can figure out whether your devices, whether your supplies or your finished goods are actually in transit, lost somewhere they're not supposed to be, or in a facility that you own and you expect it to be in. And you can do it easily and automatically. as an M2M solution provider, you can look at that and you create instant actionable information for that customer. For example, you might look at the movement, you might look at a particular enterprise's supply chain, you would identify the 10 places that the supplies might be, and if the goods are in transit and they're moving towards one of those locations, great. If they're stopped and they're in one of those locations, also great. If they're stopped and they're nowhere near one of those locations, not great. And that's where you automate at a platform level, an application level, you automate that, the collection of that information, and you deliver it to the person whose job it is to go and make sure the supplied or the finished goods get delivered. Now this next one I love, but I can imagine that you're getting tired of my American accent and my scratchy voice. So
ABC Shredding Company supplies confidential document shredding services to companies all over the country. They provide a locked bin on the customer's premises. The customer fills it up with confidential materials to be destroyed, and ABC comes regularly to empty out the bin and take the contents away. About 30% of the times they come to empty the bin, it's almost full. ABC has a business problem. Two problems, actually, and they are all about what happens the rest of the time. About 60% of the times they come, the bin is nearly empty, so they have wasted time, money, and fuel checking on something that was in fine shape. The other 10% of the time, they arrive to find a furious customer because the bin is so overfull that the workers have started stacking the confidential material on top of the bin, defeating the whole purpose that the business hired ABC in the first place. Yikes. Many business problems have M2M solutions. Numerex supports about 1.5 million M2M solutions in over 50 vertical markets, and the company applied that experience to ABC's problem. Numerex developed a battery-powered device that used sensors to detect how full ABC's bins are and attached it to the lid of the shredding bin. Cellular technology moved that data to the Numerex cloud-based application platform, where the software continuously monitors how full the bins are getting. When they're almost full, Numerex alerts ABC that it's time to go and empty them. No more wasted time, no more wasted money, and best of all, no more angry customers. Talk to the experts at Numerex about how M2M can make your business more efficient and your customers more satisfied. Numerex. Smart data delivered.
So I thought that was a really neat real-life example for two reasons. One is, in terms of the conversation we've been having, it's a great use of a sensor to collect information and make it and add value to the business. And that's exactly the heart of M2M. But what's great about this particular real life scenario is that the company had no idea that there was an M2M solution out there that was going to solve their problem. We were having a discussion was being held, and it had to do with a business problem. And that business problem, and understanding it, and having the people who were engaged in the conversation understand that there was a way to use M2M technology to solve that problem. And in fact, that it can be solved quickly and at pretty low cost. That was the key. And that's where we are in terms of the technology adoption cycle. The technology exists to solve these problems. We need to make sure that we do a good job of communicating what it is and how it works, and get the people who are out talking to the people, to the enterprises who have these pain points, make them aware that the solutions exist. So a couple of other really quick examples. This one, we'll skip back to my favorite one in a second. This one's kind of neat. We're talking about using a sensor. In this case, it was using a sensor to figure out how full something was. And in this case, because it was a flammable material, it had to be intrinsically safe, which means it couldn't create a spark. And because of the really urban environment where it was going to be delivered, just kidding, this one needed a satellite. And that was a great business challenge, something which used two different pieces that had been solved before, satellite connectivity and a sensor to figure out how full something was, and deliver them back to an application platform to a customer to give them a solution. very similar here. The customer was not McDonald's, but one of the ways that the folks in the United States stay so slim is that we have an awful lot of places that have got deep frying facilities. And it turns out there's 1 million of them. 1 million restaurants in the United States alone, and I'm sure Britain and Belgium certainly add to that tally, have these effectively oil pits. Oil has to be stored. And it's a problem for any restaurant that has it, because it's actually sitting there, and if it gets too full, you've got oil backing up literally into the place, and it costs money to come and empty it. So it's the same problem as the tank, or the same problem as the shredding bin. It's just that it's specialized because it was, in this case, fryer oil, and fryer oil actually has several different layers of stuff that floats in it. And so you've got to figure out, you take all the same information, but you do some customization at the application layer that says, this is the, whatever it is, this is the dirty pieces of French fry at the top, and this is the oil in the middle, and you've actually got to apply a fryer-specific algorithm to your tank level monitoring. But that's the beauty of having the right infrastructure in place. You've got you're repeating, you're solving a problem that you've already solved before, and you're tweaking it at the end. And then finally, maybe the most mission-critical kind of solution of all, and this is an example of one where you've got the right infrastructure in place, you know the part in the middle is right, but you've got to do custom development work both at the device end of the spectrum and at the application end of the spectrum. But you're doing it to solve a problem, and you're doing it to solve a problem for an industry that's rapidly growing. In this case, there's a customer a partner who they sell a device that's called a left ventricular assist device, and it's actually surgically implanted on your heart, and it assists your body in pumping blood for people who are on the waiting list for a heart transplant. And it actually goes out to a power pack that sits like a pager on your waist, if everyone's old enough to remember what a pager was like. And the battery pack is on a pager on your waist. And they realized that they were certainly had plenty of expertise in healthcare, but they realized that there could be a lot of value, instead of having to dock the device to figure out what was going on with it, to have a continuous stream of telemetry from the device. They could always figure out what was going on. And so in this case, we helped them build a solution which put a wireless radio into the device and built an application to monitor how well the device was performing, so that they could then in turn alert the people who were using the device if there were any issues. And that kind of solution is a different flavor than any of the things we've talked about, but leveraging the same fundamental technology to use in really mission-critical kinds of applications. So I guess my message to you is that the industry is in a great place. We're in a position now where we can sell horizontal solutions, we can build custom solutions, and we can configure solutions to sit in the middle. And this is a great time to leverage the progress that we've made so far and really help the industry to grow by communicating it to the folks who would benefit from the solutions we can deliver. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Anybody questions from Numerex and Darren, please raise your hand. I suppose there's a lady or a gentleman over there in the middle. Please could you raise your hand so we can, okay. Can you walk all the way, please? Thank you.
Whoa.
Thank you. A quick question about some of the economics that you pointed out earlier. So it was very interesting. You talked about asset tracking and how back in the day it was $25,000 assets. Now we can bring it down to $3,000 assets to make it worthwhile. Can you take us a little bit through the math on how we get to that? The CapEx cost will be this to deploy the tracker into the asset, and then monthly fees are this, and rate of loss for assets is typically this, so I reduce it by this amount, so I have an ROI in 8 months. Can you kind of take us through how those numbers play out?
I can. Maybe we should do that over a beer later. But let me give you an example of a specific customer who 6 years ago, we couldn't deliver a solution that would work for, and today his ROI would be 50%. So there is a company, well-known global company, and they rent trailers that you tow behind your car. And this company's trailers cost $6,000 or $8,000 to buy new. And this particular company loses 15% of them a year just because people don't return them. Whether they turn them into birdhouses or kid playrooms, they push them off a cliff, they don't know. They just know that 15% of them go out and never come back. And so the ROI for that is a really straightforward calculation, right? You go, be conservative, $6,000, 15%. All right, I just have to get to $900. No, I got to give them a reasonable ROI. I got to get to $700. And it wasn't very long ago at all that the device, a black box device like that, was going to cost you between $300 and $500. You can still pay. You can certainly still pay more than that now. But a minimum, you pay $300 to $500 for the device at the time. And the lowest service plan you could get that would involve connectivity and asset tracking was going to be $30 a month. And even though we had a crystal clear business case, we couldn't make the numbers work for that customer. And this is when I was with a previous company. This isn't my experience with Numerex. And now I look at that company, and I think, man, I got to walk back in and knock on that door because his payoff is, 4 months, 3 months.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that's all we have time for Darren's Q&A. So thank you, Darren, and again, a round of applause for Darren. Thank you.